Hi guys, so I'm back, and this time we're gonna go a little bit more serious and ask, would the Doctor have been wrong to kill all the Daleks? Now, obviously, on the face of this is something which everyone would disagree with in fandom, in the writer circles, etc., because it's very much framed in this idea of genocide. And am I today going to justify genocide? No, but let's wait and see how I'm going to explain this point of view. So, to begin with, probably the first thing to start with is to explain what the dilemma is itself. So, for those of you who are somehow watching a Doctor Who YouTube video without having watched literally the most famous story of the classic series, I'm not saying it's the best, but it is definitely the one that probably most people have seen. Um, in Genesis of the Daleks, the Doctor is sent back in time to avert the Daleks' creation. He tries to do this through various means, such as working with various factions of the people who end up creating the Daleks. So the people who create the Daleks are called the Khaleds. It's neat. It's like an anagram, and they're basically the Nazis. But the thing about them being the Nazis is that there are really bad ones, such as Davros, the creator of the Daleks, who is essentially Hitler. And there are ones who are people who kind of are in it because they really care about their people. Um, which obviously I think both of these are manifestations of the same thing. I don't want to go down this, but essentially the Doctor tries to get some of the less extremist Nazis to side with him, and it doesn't go very well. So he ends up with this decision at one point where essentially he decides, should I blow up the incubation room that is creating the Daleks, that's got the basic mutants, essentially the sort of infant Daleks in it? And he says, hey, this is like if you got told, would you shoot child Hitler? Um, it might change history in a good way, or it might be sort of wrong to kill a child. I don't know why I need to explain that, but that is essentially the dilemma. It's like it could save lots and lots of lives, but would it be the right thing to do? It's almost like a variation of the trolley problem. And so what I want to ask is, was the Doctor right? And I don't mean was he right because of the the kind of should you kill a child. I feel like I really need to sort of front load that before I sort of slowly lay out why I think he may have been wrong. Because what I actually think is wrong is that he's fundamentally using the wrong analogy. I'm going to go on a roundabout route to explain that and to explain why I think he's misunderstood the situation, why I think the writers have written the situation in a way that I don't agree with. But what we'll do is basically go through the takes of various different writers, and what those kind of morals say about them and their worldview until we get round to my take. So, let's start with the Termination script. So I've not read the Termination script, but what I have done is listen to the Big Finish audio, which essentially reads out the Termination script. Um, this is an audio which I really don't understand why they made. The script is very, very similar, but for some reason they decided to get Tom Baker and various other actors to recreate a draft script that only has minor changes and then ask people money for it. I'm sorry, in the last video I did also say that I like Big Finish, but this is a very strange and money grabbing move on their part. Um, but I did listen to it, and essentially there's a part here where they say the Doctor discusses the morality of his decision. He agonizes over the morality of his decision. It doesn't really explain kind of what the moral right and wrong are. It doesn't explain what the dilemma is because it's a very sort of brief, literal page description of the episode. So we kind of need to go to the additions added by Robert Holmes, the script editor, to explain what's going on here, which essentially comes down to two different kind of moral takes in the original episode. Now, there's the obvious one that genocide is wrong, that they talk about the analogy of killing child Hitler, and in a sense, it's like, oh, you're basically destroying a whole race. And the other take, which is, I think, kind of more interesting, is this idea of does the Doctor have the right to act like a god? Now, this is a take that I've kind of encountered through reading the works of Al Sandifer. If you don't know her work, you should definitely check it out. It's more interesting than anything I could say. Essentially, what she says is that the Doctor here, his dilemma is that does he have the right to change history in such a massive way? It's not that would destroying the Daleks be wrong, it's actually that the Doctor taking on the position of a godlike person who gets to decide which species live and die would be wrong rather than the actual act in itself. So, within the episode, within the story of Genesis of the Daleks, essentially, both of these are saying the genocide element is wrong and the Doctor does not have the right to act like a god. Later stories have different takes on this. The Witch is Familiar is a story which comes back to this. This is a Stephen Moffat story from the Peter Capaldi era, and it goes back to this dilemma. They literally play clips from Genesis of the Daleks in it. And essentially, what this episode does is it shows us child Davros, and this is a direct reference to when the Doctor says, oh, if you saw a child and you found they would grow up to be an evil dictator, would you kill them? And the Doctor is given that choice. And Stephen Moffat basically decides that the entire binary choice here is the problem, and you don't need to either kill the child or let them become Hitler. What you could do is try and change them. And so the Doctor shows young Davros some kindness, and that fundamentally changes some of the vocabulary of the Daleks, which, through sort of plot shenanigans, saves his companion later in the episode. I think that this is a good take. Actually, sidestepping the whole "should do you have to kill someone or not" thing, and going, "Hey, maybe we could just be nice instead," is a good take. Fundamentally, it doesn't seem to work very well because of the fact that Doctor Who needs the Daleks to continue, so we can't suddenly have a future in which they're all very nice.
Have a break. Have a Kit Kat.
Peace and love!
Another story which goes down a similar route is Remembrance of the Daleks. Now, this doesn't have the framing. This is a Seventh Doctor story with Sylvester McCoy. This story doesn't contain the framing like The Witch is Familiar of literally having child Davros in it and being set in the same setting as Genesis of the Daleks and having all of these very sort of recognizable pieces of iconography. But it is dealing with the same themes. And essentially, this comes down to a scene in which the Doctor is deciding whether to use a giant weapon to destroy the Daleks. Very similar kind of dilemma. And he doesn't really know what to do. So he speaks to the man behind a counter in a cafe. And he says, oh, decisions, decisions. What if I decided that I didn't like sugar in my tea? And this guy in the cafe, who is just fun fact, guys, played by Jeffrey from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, he essentially says if nobody likes sugar, then maybe my family would not have been sold into slavery hundreds of years ago. Um, and this is a very good explanation of this idea of all these ripples of history. Does the Doctor have the right to change such a major part of history? And essentially, what it says is that the Doctor does have the right because of the fact that people have suffered. People have faced horrible crimes of history because these victims give the right because they wouldn't want that to happen to them. And so agonizing over like is it right or wrong to like take this major decision, you should always remember, well, horrible things have happened to people because of this. And it's not just a neutral decision of, oh, do I personally take on this responsibility? It's a more general idea of, should I take this positive, radical step in order to change the world radically? And it's like, well, if it would help a lot of people and make their lives a lot better, then maybe you should. And so this essentially kind of answers the question of, does the Doctor have the right to destroy the Daleks? With yes, because the Daleks are fascists and being a racist is wrong. And if racism didn't exist, people's lives would be very, very different, but they would be very, very different in a positive sense, which basically gives us two different answers to the two different sides of the question. Like, does the Doctor have the right to change stuff? Yes, he does. He's given that right by the fact that if he doesn't change stuff, things will be worse, and people will be hurt. And does it need to be genocide, though? Genocide shouldn't be the only answer. There should be other answers to that question. Let's talk a little bit more about the actual kind of in the world answers to this question. I'm more interested in the themes and how the writers talk about them. But I think it is interesting to look over various different pieces of spin off media in which the Doctor did actually change history and he did make the decision to destroy the Daleks. This kind of happens, as far as I know, in two different pieces of media. Now, it might happen in more, but there were two that I'm aware of. The first one is in a book called Matrix. Now, I'm not going to go into huge detail on this book, but essentially it's about an evil version of the Doctor called the Valyard, who does come from the TV show. He's very complicated to explain, but essentially he's just the Doctor, but if he was evil. And in this book, he taunts the Doctor with the idea that he would have taken all the opposite, all the selfish decisions in the Doctor's moments of weakness. Now, this is actually an idea which is returned to in a comic book called The Four Doctors. I think it's quite an interesting sort of thing to do, go to various points in the Doctor's life where they could have chosen to be selfish and then see what would have happened if they decided to be selfish. In this, they choose moments such as the end of Caves of Androzani, the final Peter Davison story, in which the Doctor sacrifices his life by giving the cure to a disease to his companion rather than taking it himself. Um, in the book, he takes it himself because he's now evil Doctor, essentially. The example that they choose for the fourth Doctor, though, is that he would have destroyed the Daleks. He would have chosen to touch the two wires together, blow up the incubator room, and commit genocide. Um, Now, this is framed as the evil choice, and I think that the motivations behind it would make it evil. He just did it because he's filled with hatred. And I think that would make you evil if you just decided to casually destroy an entire species out of contempt. A more sort of complicated example, rather than just like, oh, but what if the Doctor was evil, is the more recent Big Finish audio line called Doctor of War, which essentially imagines what if the Doctor had made that decision out of the idea of helping the universe. A kind of doctor who thinks the ends justify the means. And essentially, what happens is that he starts the time war early. When he touches two wires, blows up the incubator room, it doesn't work. Instead, there are Daleks who turn up out of nowhere, kill him, and then the Time Lords and the Daleks are fighting forever. Basically, in this story, the Doctor again is viewed as wrong. He's viewed as sort of viewing the ends justifying the means, which apparently they never do. And the entire story is essentially how he basically becomes this very sort of callous, mean person who makes terrible decisions in order to win the war, except he never does because those kind of decisions never could. And so we have various stories where he lets different characters die. He does lots of horrible things, and he's like, "Well, hey, I thought the ends would justify the means," but essentially, like, it's a slightly more complicated idea of evil doctor because a doctor who thinks that killing would be right would be evil in the eyes of the writers of this story, which I think that there's something to be said for having a hero who thinks that violence is always wrong. However, I do think I might make a future video about this kind of very pious attitude towards violence in Doctor Who. I recently listened to a Big Finish audio about basically about like real life slavery, and then in it was framed that taking violent action against the slave owners would be wrong, which I see where they're coming from. They're trying to say like, oh, actually, like the good guys are always have the moral high ground, but I think it's a take. It's a strange take that I think that I may in future go into in a little bit more detail. But it's not like a specific flaw of the writer of that story. It's a wider flaw, I think, with the morality of Doctor Who as a show. But essentially, both these examples, the novel Matrix and the Doctor of War audio series, both basically explicitly say it would be bad if the Doctor did this. But essentially, I want to talk about my take because I think that the writer's morals throughout the different media essentially come down to it would be bad because genocide is wrong and the Doctor doesn't have the right to make these decisions. But as we've seen with Stephen Moffat and Ben Aronovich, who wrote Remembrance of the Daleks, there's a little bit more complexity in those takes to be explored. And my particular view is that framing this as an act of genocide is incorrect because essentially the Daleks are an ideology. The Daleks are not a people, at least not at this point. The Daleks are a mutated form of their own original people, the Khalids. And the Khalids are Nazis, and then they get mutated into uber Nazis, essentially. They're pure ideology. They had no sort of personhood. You're allowed to just blow up a Dalek in other stories because they're essentially not a person. They're just a manifestation of fascist ideology. There's an argument to be made that a lot of races in different sci-fi and fantasy stories are essentially a kind of weird race essentialism, where essentially every single member of the species has a certain set of traits because they come from that species. Um, Basically, all Vulcans being really logical, this kind of thing. Um, and this is a little bit problematic because of the fact that in real life, people have these kinds of race essentialist viewpoints. And so, even if you're not explicitly talking about real life different peoples, saying that it's possible that an entire species of aliens would all be the same kind of buys into that view. The Daleks in various other stories are not examples of race essentialism, though, because essentially they don't function as people. They don't function as, say, a race of sentient beings. They function as basically metaphors for Nazism, but lacking any form of humanity. They don't have any feelings, they don't have any sort of family or friends. All of these race essentialist storylines, they do have a lot of sort of racist tendencies where they talk sort of very specifically about these people being less than human, etc. You know, like the Klingons, etc. They don't have the same kind of empathy as our predominantly white heroes do. Problematic. But the Daleks are one step even further than that, where they basically turn into just metaphors for a specific ideology. They don't turn into people. And so when we see the Khalids, who are very much they are a set of people. They have friends, they have presumably families, that's kind of implied that they do. They have loyalties, they have pity, they have various different feelings and emotions and connections that the Daleks don't have. They're still people. Them turning into the Daleks is basically the final stage of radicalization, from turning from actual people who have bad views into just like literal manifestations of fascism. And so the Doctor blowing up the embryos and stopping the Daleks from ever existing, it doesn't stop any it doesn't stop any individuals from existing. It stops a fascist ideology from existing. And this, I think, is where we run into the problem that I think I'll come back to in a future video of what kind of action is acceptable. Um, the framing that we get in this narrative is essentially that if the Doctor was to take this massive action, it would be destroying a species and acting like a god. However, what it would actually be would be, rather than traveling back in time to kill child Hitler, it would be like traveling back in time and, I don't know, burning the Protocols of Zion or burning Mein Kampf. Um, and being like, oh yeah, we've stopped this ideology from existing. Because the Khalids would still live on. Like, the Doctor could have tried to help them work with the Thals and uh, their enemies and then rebuild their world, and then everybody lives in peace. They could have taken the Stephen Moffat lesson of changing things for the better. Um, and you could say, oh, but does he have the right to do that major change? Well, I mean, does he have the right to stand by and let loads of people be killed by fascists? So essentially, I think this is where this kind of dilemma, like that is incredibly famous in Doctor Who circles, falls down, is that destroying the Daleks is not a genocide. It's not destroying a race of people, because the Daleks are fundamentally, within the narrative of Doctor Who, not people. Like, even the worst people in the show are often shown it's not right to kill them. You know, like I've spoken about that Big Finish audio, where it's not right to kill a literal slave owner. However, it's fine to blow up the Daleks, because the Daleks aren't people, they are just pure ideology. And so this is kind of my argument here, is that saying that destroying the Dalek would turn you into someone just as bad as them, that would be true if they were a certain set of people. You know, like if you said during the Second World War, oh, we could have averted this all if we just genocided all Aryan people, then, you know, like that would be pretty bad. But that's not what's on offer here, because the Daleks are characters within a story. And within this story, they function entirely as metaphors. And so all you would be doing would be destroying those metaphors, not destroying individual people. And so this is why the Doctor destroying the Daleks is fine, actually. It would be right, it would be good. He should do it. The main reason he doesn't do it is because fundamentally you need to have your villains in your TV show. And they run a whole load of rings around that to be like, this is why it shouldn't be done. But this does lead to many instances throughout the show where the Doctor is unable, not allowed by the writers, to take very radical positive, anti-racist, anti-colonialist, etc. actions because of the fact that we need the villains to still exist. If the Doctor just blows up all the Daleks and they cease to exist, then his world will be saved from fascism, but then there'll be no villains for us to watch on TV. And also, I think it comes from this kind of like centrist urge to never take any too radical action, which I'll return to in a future video. But yeah, blowing up the Daleks is good actually.